From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. With workplace mental health becoming a safety prerogative, this is the source of information on psychological injury prevention and health promotion.
Hi, and welcome to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. My name is Jason Van Shee, and I'm one of the hosts of the show. The aim of the podcast is to rapidly increase the knowledge and application of psychological health and safety in workplaces worldwide. To help with this, we have regular guests from around the world who are leading the way in this important area. But before I introduce our guest and topic for today, allow me to introduce my co-host, Joelle Mitchell. How are you today, Joelle?
I'm tired, Jason.
Tired? Why is that?
Tired. I don't know. Just am.
Well, this is our third podcast in 2 days that we're recording.
It is. Happy new financial year.
Oh, yep. Happy new FY.
Yep.
Yeah. Is that it? Like the last financial year broke you, or bad sleep, weird weather,
I think just
illness?
Probably just a combination of things. Busy, lots of things going on simultaneously at work, and stuff at home and sleep and all of that. So, yeah.
Oh, fun.
Yep.
Okay, so we're not going to expect the same kind of barrel of laughs, Joelle, today.
I'm going to be a giant bummer today, yeah.
Okay, well, good to know up front. Yeah, bringing, as David Daniels would say, bringing your true self to work.
That's just, I gotta.
Yeah. Screw emotional labour, right?
Yeah.
Like, just tell people what you think.
Look, I have been doing a lot of emotional labour for my team. They've been going through it in their personal lives, so that does add a demand as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, our team has definitely been in the walls, both physically and with personal circumstances. So life, and trying to be not a jerk about it as a boss. Not that I would want to be, but just... You are such a jerk. So that's the emotional labour, is it?
Worst.
Because you have to hide your jerkiness.
I have to be kind and empathetic and access my emotional reserves. Yeah.
Yeah. No, you're doing a great job. I wouldn't know any different that it wasn't your normal self. So
thank you, Jason.
But I can understand why you're so tired now. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, anyway, look, our guest is patiently waiting, so we should bring her in. She is a PhD qualified psychologist researching the effectiveness of resilience training programs and the ability of workplace characteristics to develop or erode the psychological resilience of their personnel. She is the founder of the Research Resilience and Training Systems team at Macquarie University, where she is also a lecturer in organisational psychology. Welcome to the podcast, Professor Monique Crane.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Monique, it's been a long time coming, having to go through defence protocols and everything to get you on the podcast, so we're really happy that this is finally happening and we get to share out this amazing research that you've done.
Oh, thanks, Jason. It's really great to be here. And Defence is really excited about their research being shared as well.
Yeah, terrific. Looking forward to getting into it today with you.
So, to get us started, Monique, what podcast do you like to listen to?
So, apart from this one, which actually my students got me onto, so my PhD students are listeners of the podcast, and they said, oh, you've got to listen to this. And so I also listen to The Daily, though, which is a bit boring. So it's do you know The Daily? The New York Times news podcast. I think it's really good for keeping up to date with news in America, if that's what you're interested in. And I also, my sort of, I guess, like secret, not shame, but something I enjoy for myself is Esther Perel's podcast, Where Should We Begin? So I don't know if you've heard of that one either, but do you know who Esther Perel is?
No.
She's a psychodynamic-based psychotherapist who is really interested in relationships. And so I really like her approach to counselling. And so I like listening to her sessions to kind of take in some of the ways that she frames the session, what she might reflect back to her clients about relationships and things. So I actually really enjoy it. And she's very famous, actually. She tours and does talks and things like that. So I really enjoy her podcast.
So is it actual sessions that she records with her clients?
It's one-off sessions. She's written a few books, usually around why people engage in affairs, so extramarital affairs. So Mating in Captivity, I think, was one book. So she deals with intimate relationships predominantly, but she also deals with other relationships like work-based relationships, relationships with parents, things like that. So and she uses a sort of psychodynamic approach to understanding people's interpersonal relationships and how they might improve them, which is so important, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about that today. Really love her stuff.
Right, good recommendation.
Yeah. Tell us about your professional career, please.
So I completed my PhD at the Australian National University. I completed my PhD in a mixture of social and organisational psychology, actually. And I focused at that time on industrial reporting and sort of whistleblowing, I guess you could say, and when people do it and why they don't do it, and really challenging some of the ideas around who would whistleblow and who wouldn't. So that was what I did my PhD in. So I do a very different thing now, and that was largely guided by my first appointment at Joint Health Command, which was at the Department of Defence, where I was placed in a senior research and project manager role, really managing the rollout of their resilience training programs, the development, the evaluation, but also leading one of the largest longitudinal studies at that time of resilience and mental health in the military. And it was at a time when we had really high operational demands because we had people deployed to the Middle East. So obviously a very pertinent issue at that point. I transitioned into academia and I joined the Macquarie University team here at the School of Psychological Sciences, and I've been here for 14 years. We focus on a mixture of sort of occupational mental health and resilience in organisations, positive psychology and coaching, metacognitive practices that allow people to actually develop their resilience across the life course. And in particular, we focus on life transitions, like emerging adulthood, and transition into being a first-time parent, for example, which is some of the recent work that we've been doing. I teach into the Org Psych program here at Macquarie University, which is one of the largest programs in Australia. And as you mentioned, I've founded Resilience Research and Training Systems, which helps bring the research to industry as a kind of way of allowing real-world application to happen easily. And I also serve as the director for the Macquarie University Performance and Expertise Research Centre, which is primarily also focused on bringing that science-based knowledge about performance and expertise from a range of disciplines, including physical sciences and cognitive sciences and psychology, to industry partners who are really interested in extending the performance and the expertise and the training of the people that they work with. So that's me in a nutshell.
So before we get into the topic, I would just like to maybe talk briefly about resilience training broadly, because it is one of the ones that we tend to not be very impressed when we see organisations rolling out resilience training as sort of part of their mental health, or what they would say is their approach to managing workplace mental health. It sounds like the work that you're doing in resilience training is probably much more focused and contextualised than what we would see lots of organisations doing, and certainly resilience within a military context is quite a different thing, and probably needs to be relied upon a lot more than, someone working in a front desk, something like that. So I guess, any thoughts that you'd like to share on that?
Yeah, there's a few ways that you can approach resilience in organisations. So like one way which we'll talk about, I guess, and we'll focus a lot more on today, is this idea of like the system and how much the system that you're in, like the workplace, the leadership structure, the leadership engagement, with the employees actually affects people's levels of robustness and resilience across their life cycle as an employee within that organisation. So that's one way to approach it. And there's been less emphasis, I suppose you could say, on redesigning systems with resilience of the employee in mind. And there's a reasonably strong argument to suggest that's a good place to focus attention. And that seems to bear out in the work that we'll talk about today in the Navy. And that's, I think, particularly central because the workplace and the ship form such a big aspect of the lives of these people. So maybe in that situation, the system that they're in is such a big impactor. The other area that a lot of focus has been given is on individual differences, right? So giving people or having an expert come in and telling people about how to build their individual level resilience capabilities, and through a variety of ways. So that could be through cognitive behavioural type approaches, that teach people how to engage in some appropriate coping strategies or appraise situations more adaptively, et cetera. And so those types of approaches have yielded small to moderate effects, really. I mean, when you said you see things rolling out, I guess the results are as you might expect. So they're okay. They work for a short period of time. So we've seen effects up to about a month, but then those effects tend to wear off. And, it's not sustainable to kind of do training like that every month. So it just isn't usable a lot of the time. But there's broadly value, I think, in developing people's individual resilience because you do take the weather with you. Okay, and it's not as though self-regulation isn't important. It really, really is. And I'll talk about some of the interactions as well today. But the other way to approach it, which is the way we've been approaching it and that we've demonstrated what I think is a really strong evidence base, is for the use of self-reflective practice in developing individual resilience. Now, the difference here is instead of teaching people to cope in particular ways that psychologists and usually Western psychologists think is adaptive, it's really about helping people understand their circumstances, the stresses that get to them the most, and so they're being more self-aware about those things, the things that help them, so what their unique strengths are and capabilities that they bring to the circumstances, what are their gaps, so the limits in their coping capacities, so maybe they really struggle with uncontrollable events. Right, so developing capabilities in that area is really aided through reflection and developing your own personal insights about your resilience and your resilience profile, and then having people develop plans towards that. So it's less about telling, and it's more about helping people to understand themselves better so that they can actually make those decisions for themselves. And we found in military personnel this has been compared to some of the more cognitive behavioural based skills training. We've done 2 trials comparing the two, and it seems to be to yield better outcomes for personnel in terms of mental health, like depression and anxiety symptoms, which is what we measured. And we've tested it with civilian populations as well, and we do see benefits across time compared to sort of controls, like either a passive control where nothing happens or active controls. And so we feel like helping people develop their own capabilities to grow on their own has been perhaps a different and useful strategy longer term. And that's the other thing. So we show effects up to 4 months. And that's the longest we sort of measured it. So we're showing kind of extended effects beyond what we'd normally find in other skills-based training programs.
All right. Thank you. That was a very comprehensive overview of what resilience training actually means. Yep.
Yeah.
And I think probably our main criticism of these programs is that they're not delivered in conjunction with upstream systemic approaches, right? So we'll keep giving you 80 hours worth of work and expecting you to deliver it within a 40-hour paid work week, but we'll also give you some resilience training so that you can cope better with our unreasonable demands. Like that's more the pattern of behaviour that we criticise when we see organisations going down the resilience training path.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly when we've worked with organisations, we have said, look, you can do these individual level packages, you can even do the reflection stuff, but we do make recommendations around system level changes that we think are absolutely essential for sustaining positive outcomes for people longer term. And so, yes, that is a real problem with this space and a real problem with the resilience space and how it's been uptaken, I guess, by organisations more broadly.
All right. Good pre-chat. On to the main chat.
Nice segue. So, yeah, we got you on in particular, Monique, because recently you published some research on mental health trajectories across Navy deployments. So can you maybe just start out by talking a little bit about why this research is important in that context?
Yeah, so I guess one of the things is that the methodology we actually used allowed us to get a real sense of the complexity of the workplace environment for Navy people, and that hadn't been done before. And actually, you rarely see that in the broader civilian literature around job demands and resources, where researchers will often really focus on a narrow set of job demands or resources, and that's for particular reasons like theory testing and things like that. But what we wanted to do was compare them pound for pound on how much they affect things for Navy people, and in particular, in this case, their mental health. And so this is really unique research in the sense that it's unique to Navy, but it's also unique in the broader scholarship of, hey, let's compare all of these job demands, all of these resources, all of these individual differences in a way that allows us to see what their actual relative impacts are so we know how to target things. And so in this particular research, we focused on mental health trajectories on Navy personnel across a deployment or several deployments, because we looked at several ships, and the unique challenges faced by Navy personnel that might impact their mental health. Now, Navy is a underrepresented service in the military psychology, I guess, research space, because it's often Army that's being explored. And Army personnel. And while it's important to focus on Army, they do a lot of really critical work. They deploy as well to highly demanding areas. Navy, the findings in Army can't necessarily be generalised to Navy people. And that's because they have very unique deployment stresses. They are geographically isolated for extended periods of time. Their deployment presents unique lack of privacy, high levels of the demands of shipboard life, and so this creates a context of some very different types of stresses that may be worse in this context. And so our study was conducted with this population to kind of identify what the kind of predictors of resilience across a deployment were compared to a symptom type of trajectory where people are showing levels of symptoms at maybe different points. Maybe they start with some symptoms and that continues. Maybe they start to have symptoms mid-deployment, for example. So what predicts the different kinds of trajectories that we might see? And so this work was important for kind of improving policy and training practices, perhaps leadership strategies, and that's why we wanted to help Navy to understand that context a lot better than what they could right now. Yeah.
Yeah, I I hear from people in Navy sometimes that they're the poorer cousin of Army. I think maybe all the investment goes into the ships and submarines and not necessarily into researching people. So it's a good call out that you made around, sometimes defence personnel get lumped into one bucket, but the demands and the in the roles and the stresses and all the rest actually, if you think about the deployments, as you say, can be very different depending on what arm of defence you work in.
Absolutely. And, the research can tend to group them all together. So there wasn't very much research that uniquely just looked at Navy people and their mental health in this context. And so if when Navy's trying to understand what do we do, how do we best support people, it's hard to even get that sense from the work that's out there because it's just not available to them. And of course, they're reticent to just apply the lessons from Army to their own personnel who are in very different circumstances, So as one of the Navy people would say to me, we're not out there digging ditches, like they're doing, it's just a way of communicating that they're doing very different types of work.
Yeah, and I think that is a really important point for our listeners as well, because so often they want to apply evidence-based interventions in their workplace, and they'll just grab something that was in a completely different industry with a different kind of range of people. Oh, but they found these positive benefits for resilience, like a resilience training program, for example, right? We'll now deploy it in our organisation and expect the same results without really understanding the unique kind of characteristics of their people and their work. So I think that's a really good reminder to our listeners that even within this bucket of defence, which is one industry, there can be differences in demands and then the challenges and how we overcome them as well.
Oh, absolutely. There's such nuance, like between even different organisations within the same sector. Like as you say, we always suggest like some level of evaluation of interventions, as you move forward.
Yeah, good evidence-based practice.
So what really interested us in your research was that you have identified that job design is important as a determinant of mental health. Why do you think that came up as more important than individual resilience?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So when we talk about individual resilience in this case, we looked at sort of people's individual differences around, the way they might appraise situations or, how they might manage particular demands as a coping strategy or what we call self-regulation, like regulate their emotions in the context. So we looked at this kind of band of individual differences that's known to have impacts for people's coping and well-being in demanding contexts. And so, yes, we typically might expect that these types of things would have an impact. But in this case, what really stood out was the relative level of impact that job design actually did have. So why that's the case? Well, it's all speculative, right? Like I would love to know that, but I have some thoughts on it. Now, the first is that the Navy deployments, and I mentioned this earlier, it's a highly structured environment and Navy personnel operate really around the ship environment. It has a huge impact on their living, how they behave, but even it affects things like individual levels of autonomy and the things that they can actually do and utilise. And there might be fewer opportunities for them to exercise individual level strategies, say, in this environment. And so, for example, like if you're thinking about, normally people might have access to external social networks, personal space, ways that they can cope by going for a walk outside, for a long walk. It's sort of limited a lot of the time by the operation of the ship and the workplace. And you can't leave, you can't escape that environment. So the psychological demands of the environment are just ever present. So it creates this kind of closed loop system where, the quality of job design, including the interpersonal dynamics, workload, role clarity, just becomes a really dominant factor in shaping, we think, mental health outcomes in this context. And so that's why we think perhaps that it might have had a particular emphasis or level of relative importance in this setting. We still think the way people cope with those strategies is, with their unique strategies is important. But in this environment, those normal ways of coping in those typical ways may be limited. And so this has implications for other geographically isolated work contexts. So if you think about space exploration, people who are in environments like the Antarctic, I think, where they have particular teams of researchers go out there and they're geographically isolated. They're often cut off from support networks and things like that. They're stuck with the same people. They can't leave. They may not be able to embrace some of the traditional or the usual types of strategies that they would use. And so there's that particular issue. The other problem or potential is that people are selected and trained for this particular career pathway. And so it's possible that they, as a base, just have the key capacities that are necessary to do this role and do the Navy deployment role, whether that's self-selection or selection by the military or the way that they're trained, meaning that those differences in mental health outcomes become more driven by environmental conditions than individual levels of variance that we might see in an unfiltered population of people, right? Where it's just everyday people going to their jobs where that level of kind of selection is not there. So we still think that, again, individual level strategies are valuable, but in certain environments, for certain contexts, perhaps these job demands and resources become even more critical than those individual level capacities. So hopefully that answers your question around that, and also, I guess, communicates some nuance in terms of when those things might be more or less elevated, or the job design features might be more or less elevated.
Do you need more psych health and safety in your life? Then head over to the FlourishDX Academy for several free on-demand e-learning courses. If you're an internal professional, follow FlourishDX on Eventbrite to register for any of our free fortnightly interactive webinars. Our flagship professional practice program is also exclusively available for internal professionals. The 12-week course blends theory, applied practice, and interaction with other professionals through live lectures and a monthly community of practice session. Find out more about all these learning opportunities or inquire about a bespoke in-house training at the FlourishDX Academy. www.45003.org. Now back to this episode.
Yeah, and that makes sense that if we're kind of reducing the variability at the individual differences level, then the job design is going to be a lot more impactful anyway. Yeah.
And I don't actually think, and I think some of the things, and something that we probably need to do in organisational and job design specifically, is just understand the interaction between individual level differences and job design a lot better. So, it's quite probable that this is a very dynamically interacting system, and that is not easy to capture. And so one of the things that we would like to do, I guess, is to understand those interactions better. So, for example, I think we all know someone who has a knack for interpersonal conflict, right? Like getting themselves into conflict, has a real pattern of like interpersonal challenge. Now, interpersonal conflict is considered, and the kind of social environment could be considered a job design feature. If you're in an environment that's quite toxic, that has a lot of conflict in it, if it's in a very adversarial system, then it could be a system thing, but also some people just have the capacity to deal with that in a better or worse way. And so individuals may struggle with emotion regulation in these settings. They may lack social competence or in emotional intelligence, and perhaps they might not thrive or be more vulnerable to these kind of environments. And these kind of environments at the same time may potentiate that vulnerability even more. And so I really think it's probably a very dynamic system.
Yep.
Yeah, and I think, like you say, there's so much variability and individual nuance. But I remember there was one thing that Adam Grant was talking about. I can now say Adam Grant when he was on our podcast.
When we were talking with Adam Grant.
Just drop his name. Adam Grant, if you're listening, we are still referencing your conversation. He was talking about how self-care strategies can just be another to-do, or a thing on your to-do list, right? And if you've got all these demands and you don't have time, or if some of your ability, like you say, your flexibility, like in certain deployments, you just won't be able to access some of your normal coping resources, you just won't do them, right? And so without thinking about other kinds of things that might influence people's mental health in the positive, like job resources, then we can't rely on self-care, right, and resilience. We need to think about what else we can do.
Can't touch grass if you're in a submarine.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
It's very challenging on submarines. So I think, we need to provide other avenues for people to engage in self-regulation, for example. One of the things that we found in other research where we did interviews with Navy people is that if you provide resources, then people can access them and use them. Of course, that seems obvious, but it's not. It's that the important theoretical aspect of that is that the availability in the environment influenced the individual coping strategy. So you can see there that there's this sort of dynamic interaction where, yes, the job context can constrain what people can do, but it can also proliferate options as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So if we get into the discussion around job design, so what did your research find was particularly important in protecting Navy personnel's mental health?
Yeah, so one of the things that we found was important, and I don't think this will be a surprise to a lot of organisational psychology, people who work in this area, is that leadership and social support, like good leadership and social support, was really key, as well as meaningful work. So people want supportive leadership, and that's a crucial factor. They want to work in supportive environments that are both psychologically safe and supportive. Conversely, environments that had more interpersonal conflict or aggressive leadership had the reverse. So they had deleterious effects on people's mental health and well-being across the deployment. And the other aspect was meaningful work. So people want to feel that their work is meaningful and contributes to either a larger purpose. So some people can see meaning very globally, contributing to security of Australia's borders or whatever that might be. Or it can be very localized. It can be, I helped my mate today. And meaning is constructed in diverse and complex ways. And so one of the things we recommend is not necessarily to be creating meaning for people and saying, we achieved this and we achieved that, but giving people the opportunity and guidance to actually construct meaning for themselves, and knowing that that's an important thing to think about and do about the role that you play in either your local space and your team or in, a bigger and broader context. And so having the opportunity to do that, we think was really important. And some people do it naturally. Some people think about meaning naturally. They're natural abstractors of their everyday lives, and they have that natural ability to kind of flexibly work between concrete thought and abstract levels of thought about grander things like meaning. But other people might need a little bit more guidance around doing that. And so that was something that we'd be encouraging. Yeah. And I mean, of the opposite side of the house, we looked at interpersonal conflict, which was a huge marker of problems and deteriorations in mental health, but also role conflict. So we found that role conflict was strongly correlated with negative mental health outcomes. And we're not exactly sure what element of role conflict was the most problematic, because obviously role conflict is complex. But it can result from, for these people in particular, like the conflict between being away from home and home level obligations, particularly when stuff's not going well at home. That could introduce role conflict. It could be receiving different directions from different people on the ship. It could be receiving different directions compared to how you were trained. It could be a multitude of things. And so I think more research needs to go into the exact nature of role conflict so that it can be targeted really effectively as one of those things that seem to have such a big influence on how well people felt across a deployment.
Yeah, I'm glad you gave those examples. And it's not, it's funny because when we help clients with psychosocial risk assessment, work overload might be an issue, or, role ambiguity or role conflict is an issue. But how they express themselves or how people experience those hazards can be very different, right? So you really need to ask follow-up questions. You can't just go, oh, we know the answer now. We need, to deal with this. But how you deal with it is just as important.
Yeah, under each of these bundles is a world of complexity, right? Not only just how they manifest for each person, but also how they appraise them. And we also saw that things like appraisal were important features. People who appraise the deployment as an opportunity and a challenge do better. People who, and they're probably more likely to see some of these things that I'm talking about in a less negative and even possibly positive light, right? Whereas people who appraise the deployment as a threat and a risk maybe to career or relationships with one's family or children or whatever it might be, suffered more, right, across the deployment.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. I still remember Kelly McGonigal's very famous TED Talk where she talks about how to make stress your friend. It's worth a watch if you haven't watched it, listeners. But she talks about how in this research, following people over a number of years, they worked out that people who perceived stress as bad for their health were much more likely to die. It didn't matter about the level of stress that they experienced. It was the appraisal of stress being a negative thing, right? So appraisal is just so powerful for our mental well-being and our physical health, as it turns out.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like subjective experiences of objective things like events is so crucial, which is why I know a lot of people sort of say, it's just self-report. For psychologists, self-report is everything because it tells us how you perceive that situation, right? Because if you say, it's very negative for me, and another person says not so negative, same event, that the reporting of the negativity is actually what's really critical. That's what I'm interested in as a psychologist, right?
Yeah, and that's, it comes up so many times. I think there was a case in New South Wales recently where there were a couple of, I can't remember if this was the case, but it might have been the case where there was a couple of nurses who died and they had reported issues, and it was kind of put off as, no, that's not real. But it was real to them that they perceived that this was an issue and it was something that was causing them stress. And so I like David Daniels' chosen definition around psychosocial hazards. It's real or perceived factors, right? Perception is really important. So what we are very mindful of when doing risk assessment is we don't just ask, to what level do you have to work to challenging demands, or what level of autonomy do you have in your role? To what degree do you perceive experiencing this hazard has caused you to feel stressed, overwhelmed, angry, or upset? Because that's actually more important than have people had a heavy workload or low autonomy. Have they perceived that has had a negative impact on them? That perception is much more important to understand the risk of harm.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. And that's absolutely what we find when we look at those kind of interactions. Yeah.
Yeah, no, all interesting stuff. Makes sense. Tracks.
Um, so, what were the actionable steps that you and the other authors identified to be able to support the mental health of Navy personnel during deployments?
Yeah. So, like you guys probably, we'll try to attach our interventions and recommendations to things that they're functionally in place already. Um, and so, for example, like Navy has a Navy Coaching Academy program and leadership development workshops. And so, a lot of the kind of things we were seeing as being important could, in part, not entirely, be part of how we train and educate leaders, and also mentors, of Navy, or maybe more junior Navy personnel. So, and that just helps us to implement light touch interventions quickly. You know, if we are sort of attaching or extending on existing protocols or existing things that are in the environment and kind of have a place already, particularly in a busy system like Department of Defence or the ADF. Um, and so getting leaders to, for one thing, really think about the sources of interpersonal conflict on board ships, and making sure, firstly, that they're not unintentionally feeding into it. Okay, so they may not realize it, and that these things do create tension between, say, individuals or departments or sections and teams. But we wanted to make sure that they had the skills to kind of recognize, I shouldn't lean into that. You know, if someone's having a negative conversation about another team or another person, it's really important that I don't lean into that. It's really important that I don't throw fuel on the fire if that is in fact happening, and actually help, and how to help people manage conflict better. So it's not something we're necessarily all trained to do, but leaders might be able to help coach a person through those situations so that it doesn't just fester and become worse and worse. And of course, in an environment that's geographically enclosed like a Navy ship, there's real potential for interpersonal conflict to maybe escalate really quickly, maybe more quickly than in other circumstances where you can kind of get away from people that you don't have a good relationship with, or, you know, or there's a dispute. And so there's perhaps a role for leaders there in helping empower individuals to navigate some of those interpersonal challenges. But of course, creating environments where people feel a sense of belonging, and psychological safety, for example. And some, you know, small things we could think about, and I don't know if Navy has adopted any of, you know, I know they've adopted some of these ideas, but, you know, for example, are some of the standards we have for personal grooming sending a message about not belonging in the Navy context? So are all these standards necessary? Are there things that we can be more relaxed on? Can we look at the way our uniforms are to accommodate different, you know, to accommodate women better, or to accommodate different types of people with different preferences? Is there a way that we can look at those things differently? And so these are the types of recommendations that we made around sort of like social belonging and psychological safety, as well as supporting leaders in their role. Reducing role conflict. So we wanted a deeper exploration of that, which is one of the things I mentioned. We all have intuitive beliefs about what we think's going on, or where the pinch points are for role conflict. And that's the other wonderful thing about doing like data-driven research, is that you can ask 100 people what they think and they'll come up with a bunch of different answers. And some of them will be right, and some of them just don't bear out. Like, it's really remarkable. They sound really sensible and really with a good rationale, but sometimes when you actually look at the numbers and the data and put things together in analyses, people's intuitions don't bear out as they might expect. And so we all had some ideas about where the source of role conflict is, but I think it's really important that we try to identify these sources empirically in this setting so that we can target our interventions more effectively. And then, as I mentioned before, like helping people and mentoring people in identifying meaning and purpose for themselves in terms of their role was another key area. So, job meaning isn't just about the task performed. It's about seeing the impact and the availability of the person to perceive the impact of their role. And so, yes, strategies like job rotation and task configuration and can help people see the meaning of their role. If they can see the job from end to end, for example, they can gain a more holistic perspective on their work. However, things like mentoring, coaching, and leadership that helps guide people to think about the meaning of their role and what they contributed every day or what they contribute every day can be something that's really powerful for personnel as well and help them shape their own meaning. Yeah, so we provided a really long list of recommendations, but they're just some of the key ones.
Yeah, so some good ideas there, I think, to help other listeners understand the types of approaches that you could take there and different factors to consider.
Yeah, and I think overall you've kind of described a really good process of identifying the issue and then coming up with contextually relevant interventions, right? So I think that's a learning point for all of our listeners. Don't just take something off the shelf and think it's going to work. Actually do the work to make sure you're doing something that is contextually relevant. Beyond just good organisational psychology practice that you've described in this discussion, beyond Navy, are there any of the learnings that you think are useful for other industries to consider?
Yeah, I think if you kind of abstract this at a higher level, broadly, the things that we're identifying are perhaps could be seen in other organisations, for example. So we see a lot of the while their manifestation might be specific to Navy, so, in terms of what they look like on the ground, the broader message seemed to fit, you could look at it through the lens of sort of like broader models of smart job design. And the one I'm particularly thinking about is the SMART model of work design, which was developed by Professor Sharon Parker over your end in WA, and her team at the Future of Work at Curtin University. And so, if we take a look at these, sub-factors, they seem to fit that kind of idea of stimulating work. So people being able to find the work that they do being mentally stimulating, presenting a challenge, allowing them to problem solve and use their skills, and find meaningful experiences in what they do. And that's something we think applies broadly to other roles, as well as mastery. So we found things like role clarity, for example, and not having role conflict and getting feedback about the work you do as being important. And that sort of speaks to a higher level of, say, mastery and being able to master the job and feel like you're progressing in what you do and becoming more skilled. And so we think that's probably quite common. Relational features and relational resources that Sharon also talks about as being really key. We saw lots of that as having a lot of significance to Navy people, but it has broader implications for other organisations as well. And of course, the other thing that the model speaks to is this idea of tolerable work demands. Now, we found in our work that the issue of demands was so impactful. If you looked at kind of the block of demands and the block of resources that we measured, it was very clear that resources had a less impact on mental health than the demands themselves. So the demands and reducing the demands were really, really critical. And it wasn't just about like having the demands but trying to resource them. It was actually about reducing the level of demands if you could. And obviously that's not always possible, but that's also a broader thing for organisations to think about. I think, Joelle, you said earlier, like you can't just load people up constantly and then like give them like a resource, which might be resilience training, and just expect things to kind of go okay. That's not a solution for sustainable mental health. And so we found that the demands were really, really key to reducing across the board. So I think it does have implications for broader mental health at work.
I still maintain that CREAM is a better acronym than SMART, but I'll share it with you later.
The only reason that you maintain that is because you thought of it.
Yeah, of course, has to be better. Yeah, I want to see more researchers citing CREAM.
That was a really helpful interjection there, Jason.
Absolutely.
Yeah, very on topic.
Yeah.
No, I think definitely important to be able to have that that research that demonstrates that actually, you do need to address the demands. You can't just keep adding resources and think that that's going to fix it. Yeah. Do you have? Are there future directions for this research? Are you going into another phase or doing more with the data that you've collected?
Yeah, so for this particular research, we're working with Navy to sort of take a deeper dive into issues of sustainable careers for military personnel, which we think is a really interesting area for them to look at. But more broadly, outside of the military context, I think there's very fruitful areas of research in more complexity mapping, so more mapping of the complexity of job design where it's highly multivariate. So making sure that we look at a range of potential job demands and resources and individual factors and actually how they interact together. And, with the technology that we have today, that's becoming more and more available. And so, and the use of big data around some of these areas would obviously be quite important. But also looking at, like we talked about before, the dynamic interaction between individual level variables and that job context. So one of the bits of research that I'm excited about that I'm doing with my German colleagues at the moment is having a look at how toxic leadership and like really destructive leadership behaviours actually affect people's self-concepts into the future, even when they're out of that context. So the kind of longer term implications of having a bad leader, basically. And what I think may even happen is that having a toxic leader may even shape the way people interpret otherwise ambiguous leadership interactions into the future, making it more possible for them to say, how do you enter a conflict situation or overinterpret negatively what's intended by, an ambiguous interpersonal interaction that they might have because of that prior experience, even outside of that work context. And does that have implications for people moving forward in other roles, right? So that's where that dynamic interaction may be really important because people may carry this around with them into the future. And for someone who likes individual differences like me and cognition and the implications of cognition, that's really important.
That's really interesting. So sort of your brain has been primed to look for early indicators of threats based on that kind of that leadership or the behaviour coming from that leader, and then continues to alert you to potential threat from otherwise neutral behaviours because of those the patterns that it developed during that period of time. Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's not beyond imagination, right? Like that it would have carryover effects into new relationships that you might have. Um, I can imagine that happens in romantic relationships, right? I think that's what Esther Perel would say.
Yeah, that's what we refer to as baggage, right?
Yeah. So you can have boss baggage.
Definitely. I think almost everyone has some level of boss baggage.
From prior bosses.
From prior bosses.
Sure.
Well, Monique, it's been a really great conversation with you so far. We're up to the second last question. It's a question, as a listener of the podcast, you will know we ask everyone who's on the podcast, if you actually make it all the way to the end, that is. Yeah. What are your hopes for the future of workplace mental health?
I think, look, as you were alluding to before, like looking at this beyond individual responsibility, I think is really important. And we're moving that way, right? Like there's some really exciting stuff that's happened recently, at least since 2022, around workplace mental health and a greater emphasis on job design and psychosocial hazards and things that make up those risks that are implications of the job itself. I think that's a really critical step for ensuring that workplaces are healthier and fostering the right kinds of resources and limiting the demands that they place on people. I think that's essential. But also, I hope that workplaces see the value of engaging the right expertise, like yourselves, around making and implementing evidence-based interventions to create meaningful change. I'm not always sure that happens. And so I like to think it does as a researcher, but obviously, like, there's the real world out there, and that's not necessarily happening. And people can go on their intuition. And I guess a point I was making before is that you might think you know, your understanding of the situation might not actually bear out for people outside of yourself and the way you've perceived those circumstances through your anecdotal experience of it. And so it's really important that we get the data, that we understand what the key pain points for people are, so that we can introduce the right types of intervention in a way that's data-driven and proactive. So they're some of the things that I would really like to see happen in the future. But I think there's a good push towards that.
Yeah, absolutely. And you could say we just had a whole 2 days conference on those exact topics. So, yes.
All right. Final question for you. What words of advice do you have for listeners who want to work in the area of psychosocial safety?
For professionals who are interested in the field of psychological health, my advice is that it's a really evolving and meaningful area. And, more than ever, I think people are understanding that this is a workplace concern and not just an individual concern, and that job design requires systematic solutions to make sure that it's sustainable. I would say stay evidence-based, keep abreast of the research and the really great stuff that's happening in the research space, both, by academics, but also providers out there that are also doing research in real-world ecological environments and that are making a real difference. And I think taking a holistic approach. So, it's not just about fixing people. It's about creating environments that allow people to thrive and really thinking about it beyond risks, I guess, in terms of like considering how workplaces can foster meaningful engagement and long-term well-being. It's a really rewarding field. I think if there are any people who are in psychology or studying psychology at the moment who are listening to this, I would encourage you to think about organisational psychology as a career pathway, because not a lot of our students actually know that organisational psychology exists. And it does, and it provides a really excellent footprint on the world, making workplaces healthy and happier places to be, and helping individuals in really practical, large-scale ways. And so I think if you're passionate about making a difference, both to individuals but also at system levels, the field of organisational psychology is a really great one to get involved in.
I agree.
Great promo for
Yep.
the industry or the profession.
We'll send that snip to COP.
Shove it in there somewhere,
Yep.
Yeah, we'll give it to College of Org Psychs and
Yep.
SIOPA
Yep.
to use in their promotional material.
And shout out to your PhD students who turned you onto this podcast as well.
Yes, they'll be wanting to listen to this, so you'll have to let me know when it comes out.
We will. Yep.
We will. Surprise listeners, it's out now. So, Monique, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. Always good to have listeners of the podcast on, but also great to feature people like yourself who are just doing really good practice in real world scenarios. So thank you so much for coming on and sharing, despite all the hurdles that you had to go through to be able to share the work that you've been doing.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for your time. I really appreciate you inviting me on.
Awesome. Thanks, Monique. Well, listeners, that brings us to the end of this episode. Remember, we do record these over video. Monique had to clean up her background before we started today because I didn't tell her beforehand that we're on video. Obviously, she doesn't listen all the way to the end because I say this every episode. But you'll have to check out the video. You'll have to see what's in the background in her office, including the Die Hard poster. You will find that video on the Flourish DX YouTube channel if you're not already watching there. We also take snippets of these conversations and we put them on the Flourish DX LinkedIn page. So do follow that if you want to get some of the best gold from these conversations. And then feel free to connect with myself and Joelle if you want to continue the conversation. But that's it for today. We'll catch you next episode.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. To stay up to date with the latest on psychological injury prevention, follow Flourish DX on LinkedIn and subscribe to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast at www.psychealthandsafety.com.